my bad. Okay, so what we are going to do is review a sample discourse map. I will touch on the individual components of the discourse map analysis, reviewing what each of those pieces are. And then at the end of it, we can dialogue a little bit about what are the applications to K-12 work and interpreting. So that is it. So just setting the bar for our group today and what we can do. Okay, so this slide, here's to all the people who remain unharmed because I have coffee and a sense of humor. Now, my presentation style and my approach to how I work with participants, how I work with students, I do try to, I'm very serious about the work that I do.
I'm sorry, Pam, we're going to interrupt you just for a moment. We're one slide behind you. I'm seeing the one that has the expectations.
It's really weird. Now do you see it?
No.
You're not seeing the slide move?
I'm seeing like your view with the many slides on the left, and then it's not in like speaker view.
Give me a second. There you go. So here, my slide, here's to all the people who remain unharmed because I have coffee and a sense of humor. To repeat, and for those of you who know me, I do have a sense of humor. You may not like it. You might find it very flat. It's okay. But I am very serious about the work that we're doing and the services that we provide to our kids in school, to the people that we work with in any setting. But that's a little bit about who I am. So I just want to preface that if you and I have never met. So a little bit about me and who I am. I am from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I currently live in McGuanago, Wisconsin. And both my parents are deaf. I also have a stepdaughter who has a hearing loss. And currently my father and my stepdaughter do live with me. So I'm actively living with people that require sign communication. My path to becoming an interpreter has been an interesting one. And I grew up with parents who were very active in the deaf community, but they were of a generation that could not explain to me anything about deaf culture or American Sign Language, but definitely grew up immersed in going to the Greater Milwaukee Association for the Deaf, Wisconsin Association for the Deaf, just any sort of activities, social events that deaf people went to, but I did not really understand deaf culture or anything like that. So when I graduated from high school, everyone assumed I should become an interpreter. And I don't even think I knew what it meant to be an interpreter when I was 18 or 19. I applied for the ITP and I got in. I don't even know how I got accepted, to be honest with you, but I did, but then I dropped out. And I had to move to Arizona. I had to find myself. And then I came back to Milwaukee and I started my degree at UW Milwaukee, and I ended up doing the interpreting training program. And that was very life-changing for me, very transformative for someone who grew up in the deaf family and not really understanding what my parents had gone through, how they communicate, what their perceptions were. So once I started that trajectory, the rest is history. But another love of mine was always to teach. When I worked in the restaurant business, I worked at Chuck E. Cheese, yes I did. And I did have to dress up as the rat, as I like to refer to Chucky as very lovingly. But because I'm really tall, I only had to do that role for a short amount of time because I was very terrifying to the young children as this big monstrous Chuck E. Cheese walking through the restaurant. But when I was working at Chuck E. Cheese and when I worked at TGI Fridays, that's a whole other workshop, I was always training. I was always mentoring. I was always working with people. I would do professional development. So that was also in my blood to do that as well. And so I knew when I was in the interpreting training program at that some point that I would want to teach. And I feel very blessed to have the opportunity to have interpreting experience, to have my master's is in adult education and supervision. And so for me, it's been a fantastic journey so far. When I graduated from UW-Milwaukee, I started working at UW-Milwaukee as a post-secondary interpreter. Love doing that type of work. I love it because you're constantly immersed in learning all the time. The other thing that I really enjoyed about post-secondary education, it just encouraged me to keep learning and do more professional development. So then after that, I became the director for Deaf and Hard of Hearing Ministry for the Archdiocese of Milwaukee. And that too was a phenomenal experience because I worked very closely with the deaf community in many capacities. It taught me a lot about language, how deaf people communicate with one another, how they explain things. I really got an insider view and started recognizing I needed to start making changes to what it was that I was doing. But after I worked at the Archdiocese of Milwaukee, I then finished my master's in that time. Then I decided to apply for the coordinator position at UW-Milwaukee in the interpreting training program. And I've been doing that since 2007. I've been teaching in the interpreting training program since 2002 as a part-time or adjunct instructor. In addition to that, I used to do a lot of theatrical interpreting, a lot of post-secondary. I've done some community work. I did a lot of religious work, really. I have noticed, and I've said this before to other people, I tend to gravitate towards things that are inspirational and fun and uplifting. I did attend the mental health interpreting training last week, given through Alabama, and learned some really wonderful things, but I'm like, yep, and it has affirmed why I'm going to stick with what I do. So that's a little bit about me. I do have 5 kids. I did not birth all 5 kids. I have 3 stepdaughters and I have 2 sons. And I also have 2 dogs who you might hear bark from time to time. I will try to minimize that distraction, but all of us working from home, and I have a lot of people living in my house. We'll see what happens. Okay, so that's me. And move on to the next slide. Just keeping track of my time. So I know that WESP and this particular workshop is targeting K-12 interpreters. My material is more general, right? And my hope today is that you can see the connection to the things that I'm sharing with you today, and how do we then apply that to what it is that we are doing in the classroom. Webinars, workshops, in terms of application and how people learn and grow, it tends to be very minimal. If anything, you walk away with an awareness of a possible tool, right? But what you choose to do with that tool after we end today is really up to you. And I make this point in this slide here. Our sense of purpose is not simply created by the work that we do, but through the choices that we make. And I would say as professional interpreters, we definitely have an obligation to not just show up for the work. What are we doing outside to up our game, to enhance our skills, to be stronger, to be better? I can't imagine someone that plays an instrument or an athlete who basically just does their sport without thinking deliberately every single day how they can enhance and perform better, right? And we as interpreters have the same responsibility. It doesn't happen passively. Skill development is a very active, deliberate process. And I know you know that, but I have to emphasize that. These webinars are great, but I've challenged you today to take this a step further and think about what it is that you're doing to reflect on your work. Who's supervising your work? Many of you in K-12 tend to work alone. You are the only person in your building that knows sign language often. And what happens over time is that there's less and less supervision of what you're doing. And then over time with less and less supervision, it becomes very daunting to have someone look at your work. It becomes scary. And I recognize that. I do hope that you have somebody that you could work with, another interpreter that works in another K-12 school district, and the two of you engage in some sort of practice that enhances your interpreting ability so that the students are getting what they need from you in the classroom. Okay. So to put this into perspective and why I am so emphatic about these discourse maps or this analysis, I think I need to give you a little bit of my own background and what I found very challenging. When I was in the interpreting training program, had excellent teachers, but that was in the 90s. I just keep thinking of, I don't even know what the name of the movie is anymore, but Drew, his name is Drew. Why are you so old? That movie. Oh my God, the Minions. Anyway, that's how I feel sometimes. Why are you so old? When I was in the ITP in the 90s, it was a one-year program. So it was very intensive. So I still ended up getting a degree. It was an education degree, and you could embed the certificate within a four-year degree, which is what I ended up doing. So we had a 6-week summer course, then we did fall, spring, and then we did another summer course, and then we were done. And I remember feeling so frustrated in my program. One, being a coda, I probably imposed a lot of my own expectations that maybe people did or did not have of me. So I struggled that way. People made a lot of assumptions that I knew how to be visual and I knew what to do with it. And all I heard over and over and over again is show, don't tell, show, don't tell. And I would watch some professional interpreters, and we had one or two classmates that seemed to understand what it meant to show versus tell, which when I say that, show meaning be more ASL, and tell, stop being so linear and following the English word order. But it was all implicit. We were expected to acquire language in an immersion type way. And we would watch different language models. And I was always impressed, but I never understood how they did what they did. And that added even more stress to me because I felt like I should understand it and I didn't. And I didn't know how to make the switch from English to ASL. I impressed myself at times because I thought if I used a classifier, if I used some space, then was that not ASL? Well, we all know that it wasn't. So I knew that I was struggling and had a difficult time that way. So then, I don't know how, but shortly after I got done with school, I was able to get certified and had some success that way. But when I started working for the Archdiocese of Milwaukee and I was doing deaf ministry, I would be facilitating meetings with everybody was deaf. And my dad is a deacon for the Catholic Church. So he was in these meetings as well. And at that time, so this is the late 90s, 2000s, I would be running these meetings inside, and I would express something, and my dad would then monitor what the vibe of the group was, and he knew instinctively that they did not understand what I signed. What? So he would reinterpret a lot of the things or explain it, and I began to pay attention to that. So they would do that for each other. If an interpreter was brought in and there was a group of deaf people, they tended to do this, what we call deaf interpreting. Like, okay, there is something that's not happening in my work that needs to change. And then when I transferred to the university and I started to work with our ASL studies program, they also have a lot of deaf instructors, fluent users of American Sign Language, which is another wonderful experience for me, that I get to be around all of those folks. But I kept seeing the same thing happen. When several deaf people were attending a faculty meeting and we had these fantastic interpreters, I would watch them and how they would explain things to one another. And I'm like, okay, we need to be watching that, because something I'm not doing, they have to take and expand or explain or do. So I found that to be frustrating on my end. And so that was a wake-up call for me to do something very, very different. The one experience I think that really changed me was when I was in New York for a theater training. And it was, again, I think it was like a flashback triggering event, because at this week-long training with all these superstars from all over the country, they would have us engage in all these group activities, partner up, and I think deep down inside I was seeking permission to do things that I thought I could do and I saw people do, but I didn't know how to put language to it. I didn't know how to describe it. I didn't really understand it in a very in-depth way. It was very hodgepodge. So I shut down again that week, and I was very ineffective, and had to do some real soul searching to figure out what I could do to improve my skill, because I think I had plateaued. I think I had just been stuck as an interpreter. I was a good interpreter, but I wasn't an excellent interpreter. And I think things were definitely missing from my work. So I am sharing with you just my own personal journey as to why I'm so excited about doing this process, because I have trained my brain to do things in a way that I did not have before. So with that, I think it's really important as interpreters, we tend to jump to the product. And I know that in your programs and in your training, you've learned about different interpreting theories. You've learned about Sandra Gish, goal to detail, detail to goal, where we have to look at the whole and then we can understand the parts, and we have to work, from bottom up to top down processing. We have Dennis Copley's error analysis, miscues, that kind of stuff. We have Betty Kalanimus's work. All of those are wonderful theories to help us understand what's happening with the brain before we even produce anything. But I came across something, it was discourse mapping. So to be fair, this concept of how I do discourse mapping is certainly not something of my doing. I have read many good articles, textbooks on this process, and so I will give credit to where credit is due, and we'll get there in just a moment. But I have learned that once we really tease apart what's happening in the source language and understanding all the nuances of it to the best of my ability, once I have a better grasp of that, then what I can do in the target language, now I have a lot more confidence. And I can be deliberate about the choices that I make. And as a result, I think I have a much more dynamically equivalent target language interpretation. So for me, right, competence leads to confidence, and it puts us in a happy place, right? That's what we all want. And regardless of what setting I work with, regardless of working in K-12 or out in the community, I want to feel competent, and I want to feel confident so that with the quick decisions that I must make in this setting, I want to know that what I'm doing, I have the professional background and expertise to do this well. That's what we're going for. And again, this tool, I think, will help us do that. I just like to throw in this slide. It's somewhat random. The camel is a horse designed by committee. I don't know if many of you have heard this before, but I can tell you when I was interpreting when I got this said during a presentation, I had no idea what it meant. But it's a good example of, yes, we get idioms thrown our way, and those might seem obvious that I need to go for meaning and tell you what it means. And in case you don't know, it means that when we work maybe individually, it's less messy, and our end result might be a beautiful stallion. When working with several people, it could be a messy process, and in the end, what we end up with is camel. You know, not as good looking as the horse, but you know, that's sort of the struggle of working in community work. But just keep that in mind as we move through some of these slides and understanding what is our responsibility with language and what is it that we want to expose these kids to. Here's my other disclaimer. I know that many of you are working with kids that speak for themselves. They maybe use signed English. I'm very aware of that. My goal is, yes, I'm going to be talking about English and American Sign Language, but many of the things that I'm talking about with the target language of ASL still apply to what you're doing in the classroom. What we have found and what the research tells you is even though a child might receptively or expressively use English, receptively, they might need things that are implicit in English become explicit in signed English, right? So there's still interpreting that has to be done, even though we are doing things in English word order. So I hope that you understand my point on that we still are interpreting in the classroom, regardless of whether the student uses American Sign Language or prefers transliteration. Okay, so discourse maps are a way to represent things visually. Helps me understand as I move through a discourse or through a presentation or through a classroom lecture. Helps me understand how this idea relates to that idea and to that idea, right? So it helps me to understand by breaking down things into parts, helps me understand the whole. And then why is this particular person saying what they're saying? I understand the impetus behind it. I understand their intention, even though it's not always explicitly stated. And that's where we struggle sometimes in the classroom or when we're out doing community work. So if you are interested in doing more reading on discourse maps, there is a book by, it's called Innovative Practices Teaching Sign Language Interpreters is the name of the book. You can get it from Gallaudet Press. Betsy Winston, this is a lot of her work. And I also believe that Christine Monikowski is also did a lot of work with this. And in that book, it explains how to help and guide students through getting the source, analyzing it, and then how do you move them through and then get them to the target language. And so that's really where I got the idea, I got the framework for this. And since then, working with different people, we've added a couple things to our discourse analysis. I would ideally, if I can get back to school and do my PhD, I would love to expand this discourse analysis and dive really deep into it about the effectiveness of it and how to create a structure, a template that can better prepare interpreters. But that'll happen in a couple of years, I promise you. Funny story about this is that when I was new to this discourse analysis, I had been attending a professional development training in Salt Lake City. Sorensen VRS Interpreter Institute provided phenomenal training with superstars from all over the country. It's fantastic. And I was in a small group at this training, and I am going on and on and on about how I really love this tool because we're all teachers and we're sharing with one another all the things that we find effective. And it was also a way to learn from one another. And I'm in this group. I don't know everybody. I'm still fairly new as a coordinator. I'm new as a teacher. And I rave about it and how it's really helped me in my own practice, and that I'm really excited about things that are how we're developing this tool. Gosh, I can't remember who the author was or who was the person that who created this. That's the tip of my tongue. I'm sitting in this group, and sure enough, across the table from me is Betsy Winston, and she doesn't say anything, but I'm referencing her work, and then she, in a very humble, respectful way, she said, "Yeah, that's my stuff." So I said, "Okay, yes, Betsy Winston, you are the best. Thank you so much." And she did get a good chuckle out of it, and the group did find that somewhat entertaining. That I did not recognize her, but I was new. I didn't know. I do know, and I'll never forget. But Betsy Winston is wonderful, and she has a lot of wonderful trainings and webinars. I definitely would look into her work if you would like more brilliance to impact and improve your interpreting work. So there's that. So she has provided this framework. The other thing that a discourse map can do for you, or just this analysis as we begin to train our brains, is that you start to identify what are the themes, what are the topics, how things flow one by one. We'll jump into that a little bit too. All right, just double checking something. The other thing with discourse maps is that it's really important, and again, this is not anything you don't know, that you probably have heard of, but discourse analysis really pushes this to force you to think about, okay, so what? So the register, who, in a classroom, right? What's the age level? What is the teacher trying to accomplish? Is it a school presentation? There's many ways that we have to shift and think about register. And we also have to think about the participants within that particular setting, within that moment. At any point throughout the day, what I do the first hour may not look like the same in the third hour, right? So are you even aware that you're making those shifts? Are you even aware that you must be making adjustments? You should be, right? And I would say the same thing. It's when I speak in English, I must adjust and accommodate who it is that's in front of me and do so appropriately. And so again, remembering what are the speaker's goals. And then when we talk about participants, what I just mentioned, but also I just want to give you some ideas on what might change. If you've ever walked in on a couple who has been fighting, right, and you walk into that moment where they are really awkward because you came in when they weren't expecting you to come in on that situation, and let's say you were having to interpret that, you notice some tension. I might want to recognize that, because everything that they say from that point forward might be very stressed or forced, or they're clearly trying to restrain themselves because they're trying to withhold their anger, right? That they were arguing. But now another person has entered into that scene, they begin to adjust. I would argue as an interpreter, we have to do something with that. We have to recognize that there is some sort of energy, there's some sort of tone, there is something that I have to do with that I must then convey to, whether it be my students, whether it be deaf consumers that I'm working with out in the community. So that's part of this discourse analysis too. We have to remember the status of individuals, right? And so what level of expertise does this person bring? What, because there's protocol, there's expectations. The way that I talk with my friends and family is not going to be the same way that I talk with the chancellor of UW Milwaukee. I think that's really important too. A really good example here at UWM, if you are a designated interpreter, you really have to be aware of status and making those adjustments as needed, because at any given point within one day, I'm working as a designated interpreter with our ASL staff. I'm not the designated interpreter, but if I were, this is what would be happening is, hallway talk, bubbler talk, whatever you want to call that, the way that my deaf colleagues want to interact with their hearing colleagues definitely needs to sound a certain way, right? I have to express that in English a certain way so that they can make that connection, so that they can build that rapport. So being really aware of how do work colleagues talk to one another, and then making that application to what I do as an interpreter so that my deaf colleague can have an equitable experience. Because a lot of information is shared in bubbler talk, although bubbler talk seems to now have gone away because we don't get to be with one another. So if anything, maybe this is an equalizer for deaf people. We've pulled out the opportunity for the water cooler. But so that designated interpreter has to think about what we call that water cooler discussion. And then we go into the faculty meeting, right? And we have our chair that's running the meeting. And there's an expectation of how the meeting is run. Do we raise hands? What level of formality do we express in that type of meeting? One, because we're dealing with academics and very smart people. I then too have to think about noticing how people communicate in these faculty meetings. I must then provide an equivalent experience for my deaf colleague, right? And then when we're meeting with the provost or the chancellor, and showing proper respect to those individuals, are you as an interpreter thinking about what it is I have to adjust and change so that I am meeting those expectations, and that our deaf colleagues or whomever I work with is experiencing the same thing, that we're meeting expectation. So we definitely need to understand that too. And then relationships, understanding what is this person's relationship to one another, and then what sort of schema do they bring. And in K-12, kids are definitely much more familiar working with a hard of hearing student or a student with a hearing loss or a deaf student. But you encounter a lot of new teachers, people coming in, you have substitutes coming in, and you also then have to think about, what sort of schema do they bring, how they're going to interact with the kids. It might change daily depending on what's happening. So discourse analysis also gives us that ability to do that. So these are just some additional examples to highlight how settings and other factors impact what happens when we're interpreting. So the way that I present myself, hopefully, in a religious setting would be very different than if I was at the local bar. If maybe not, maybe you feel like I am who I am and I'm going to do what I do. That is okay. No judgment. Most people might adjust accordingly. Interpreters must do the same. How people express anger at home versus expressing anger at work looks very different. It does, usually. People that express anger at home the same way they express it, well, I would say if they, I'm looking at the dark side of people. Maybe we are all really good at managing our anger. We tend to be a little bit more open with it at home than we are at work. Usually you get fired if you are that open with your anger. So it doesn't really work in your favor. But anger, it gets expressed differently. But as interpreters, we can hear anger, but we also know that someone is controlling it because they understand the social consequences if they don't control that anger, right? Many people have worked in VRS and they've seen what I would call the anger at home, the difference there. But knowing those things matter, right? Because even though the tone, the pace may sound very controlled, underneath, I know they're bubbling, right? So then how do I do that? Think about it with a teacher in a classroom. Teacher is frustrated with her students. They're not listening, they're not paying attention. Little Bobby can't focus, and she might express something along the lines of, "Can I help you?" Right? Very famous line from Robin Dean's Demand Control Schema book, where in that particular context, is the teacher really asking, "Can I help you?" She's frustrated, she's angry. And basically she's telling the student, "I need you to pay attention. I need you to behave." That's really what she's saying, right? So you always have to be thinking, what's the why behind what he or she is saying in that particular piece. So that's a good example. Time of day, right? So energy levels shift throughout the day. Morning, I don't even know why high school has kids show up at school at 7:15 in the morning. I think that's cruel and unusual punishment, but that is the reality that we live in. So that first hour is pretty wasted on kids at that time. And then the last hour of the day, not so good either, right? So you will see different things from our deaf students and also from our instructors. So that also plays into some of the choices that we have to make. That becomes part of our analysis and why you might see some language deterioration, or you might see different attitudinal responses. You have to, again, keep training your brain to recognize these things. All right, I have this funny video we're not going to watch, but it's really fun to watch this video of parents talking to their kids about the birds and the bees. This one is adorable, of how the son reacts to what mom and dad are trying to teach him about how he was, about his creation and how he was born. So maybe later on you can go and watch this video and be entertained. But the way that sex education is talked about in high school versus how a parent talks to their child who is 4 or 5 is going to sound very different. They have the same goal, they have the same intention, but adjustments are made based on who's in front of me and what who my participants are. Another benefit of doing this discourse analysis is the idea of what's the purpose, like what's the goal, right? And so when you go into a situation and you are hired as an interpreter, what I do for a job interview, right? Understanding the deaf person, if that deaf person is applying for a job, I have to be very clear about what their purpose is versus a deaf person wanting to buy a car. I know we don't get to interpret buying a car, but I would say as a coda, I might have had that experience. And I would definitely, I have 2 brothers that were finance managers in the car business. So maybe this is why I chose this example, who knows? Anyway, but the job interview, understanding the setting, the protocol, who's interviewing me is very different versus buying a car. As a hearing person, understanding how car sales work, what sort of things must you be prepared going in, and you know the consumer in the job interview is really trying to impress them so that he or she gets the job, right? And they want to show them that they have the abilities. When it comes to buying a car, it's very all about me and not trying to please the car salesman. It's more about I want to walk away with a car that I can afford, that's not a lemon, and that will provide me with what I need, right? So, thinking about that and then thinking about making the application to the classroom. What is the teacher doing this day? What at the end of this hour does she want these kids to be able to accomplish? Or what does he want these kids to be able to accomplish? Are you thinking about that throughout your day? What is the teacher's goal? What is their purpose? And so then if you understand that every day, every hour, then you understand the examples that he or she gives. You understand the illustrations. You understand that this is why the activity is happening. Sometimes that's made explicit by a teacher, and sometimes that's not. And with our deaf and hard of hearing kids, the idea about language access and language deprivation and incidental learning or tertiary learning, I think people really underestimate how much deaf and hard of hearing kids miss out. And what hearing kids take for granted because they are constantly being bombarded with information. They don't, it's not being directed at them, but they passively pick this up. But as interpreters, we have to do more work, and you want to, what we take for granted, we have to take what is implicit and make it explicit for our deaf and hard of hearing kids. And when I was at that mental health training last week, it was very, very eye-opening for me on so many levels. But I will say, with my parents, and my mother passed away a little over 3 years ago, and so my dad is with me, and I forgot what it was like to live with deaf people. I don't know if I just did this or what, but now my dad is back with me. And now that I have all these years of experience, it's very clear to me what language deprivation has done to my father. And what we used to call, and I know you know these terms, oh, he's grassroots deaf, or no, he's very, very ASL deaf. Really what they're saying, to be honest, is they are language deprived. There's language disfluency in what you're seeing. And that's what I see. And I can see a lifetime of that language deprivation and what it has done to my father. And I say that respectfully. How my father has managed 76 years in his life, it's impressive to me that he was able to compensate and overcome that. But I can see where the gaps are. I can see why he reacts and does things the way he does. I have a much better understanding of that. Now, he's profoundly deaf. So let's use my stepdaughter, who went through the K-12 system, no interpreter, no interpreter, no interpreter. She has a hearing loss. They would tell us because she could express herself in English and she seemed to do all the right things, that they felt that she did not need an interpreter. But I could tell that in terms of incidental learning, in terms of that tertiary learning, she was also suffering from language deprivation. And to this day, we are still working to catch her up. She has, since her junior year, she went to the Wisconsin School for the Deaf, picked up the language quickly, and now is in college working with interpreters. She's able to advocate for herself. But even in my interactions with her, things that I assumed she knew because she was hard of hearing, she also has gaps. So I share that with you as interpreters. Do not assume that the student or the child understands what the lesson is or what he or she wants the kids to walk away with, right? You have to be really on top of that and explain intention sometimes, or the purpose, or the why. You know, this is what we're doing with that. I am trying to get to my next slide. So the other benefit, I think, with these discourse maps too is what I call the glue or the flow, right? So when I'm able to identify what the discourse structure is, what the discourse type is, there are linguistic features that are inherent to each. And each of those discourse types you're going to see patterns, and you begin to recognize those patterns. So then you're able to predict with much more confidence what's going to happen. A simple example is if I am using if I know that we're in a procedural discourse. So in the classroom, science, great example, right? Telling the students, we're going to do some lab work and we're going to start with this, and then next I need you to do that, right? So I know things that are going to be chronological, and that they're going to be in steps, and it's going to be in future tense. So the first thing I need you to do when you go to the table and you grab your equipment, this is what I want you to do, okay? That's a real simple example of it's procedural, but then I can make some decisions about how I use my space, how I emphasize it, how do I use proper non-manuals to show that these are directions or it's a command. Basically, it's a command, do this, do that, right? And then I can be very clear in my interpretation when I'm working with the student. Another thing that discourse analysis allows us to do is really pay attention to transitions in our work. That is a big thing that I have to work on with students and in my own work on how do I make these transitions even more explicit. When teachers are working with a PowerPoint or when they're working with something visual, they're moving through things. They may not explicitly state it. Again, I might have to go, you know what, I need to make this implicit and make it very clear as to what we're doing with this with this slide. Think of it as flow, good flow. We all want good flow. Okay. So to me, knowing how to do this, training my brain to understand all the parts, isolating the parts, helps me to understand the whole. And really the end game is prosody, right? And that it has a natural rhythm to it. It looks natural. We don't look robotic. We're not pausing at incorrect times. It's different when our presenter is pausing inappropriately or is dropping their thoughts or engaging in what we call incoherent discourse. That's different. And if that is the experience that my class is experiencing, then I too must provide an equivalent experience. But so that's different. But when you have a teacher or presenter or facilitator or whomever is working through something, explaining something, I have to make sure that my prosody allows that deaf student or that consumer to be able to process it without making them have to work. We as interpreters often make deaf people work twice as hard as they need to because one, our prosody, our flow is off because we're not really owning all those things that I just talked to you about. We're not in control of that. And so we're just throwing darts and hoping that, you know, yeah, I got the signs, all the signs made standard dish. I understood all the signs, but I don't get the message, right? And that is the struggle. So this is another big benefit of discourse analysis is that understanding that will allow me to control my pace, will allow me to control my prosody, that will allow me to have better facial expression and mouth movement in order to be effective. Okay, so sadly, and I don't know if any of you in the Zoom or webinar universe know how to make videos accessible through the PowerPoint. I'm not sure why it's not happening, and we tested it a couple different ways. But in Okay, so you can watch the rest of the video, but for the purposes of the analysis here, I am going to stop it with where I have it for the discourse map. But I always like this video because it is a good reminder of the way that we should live our lives and how we move through this world, and just appreciate what's good and appreciate what is important. So
Pam, I'm sorry, one moment. I'm going to interrupt you. We have somebody who says they cannot hear you now.
Really? Can you hear me?
Other people are saying they can. Okay.
Okay. So how do I help them?
Yeah, we've got lots of other people saying they can hear you, so I'm not sure if that person needs to work on something on their end, but go ahead and we'll keep working on it.
Yep, thank you. Okay. Okay, here we go. So one of the things that we want to look at in a discourse map are what I call cues and signals. So whether this is in English or in ASL, these are actual words or signs that are produced that signal something, meaning I can then predict what's going to come next based on this particular word or words, or this phrase, right? And so some examples of cues are words for cause and effect. Because of this, this will happen, right? So a conditional in ASO. If this happens, then we can't go to the picnic. For me in the chat, what I think, Mary, would be helpful is if we can get people, because I keep seeing things pop up in the chat, and it will be my tendency to try to look towards that, and I know I'll get pulled away. So if people can contact you directly, Mary, as the co-host, and then we remove it from everyone, that would be helpful.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I just have to admit, I am like that dog from Up, and if something calls my attention, I'm like, squirrel! That is me. So knowing my weaknesses, I share them with you in the spirit of transparency. Anyway, okay. So one component of discourse mapping is identifying cues and signals. And my other disclaimer with this process is that this is a work in progress. This is by no means the only way to do it. This is what I've tried to do with my students and with other people that I work with who have graduated from the program and want to continue their professional development. So I do have working interpreters who do engage in this type of analysis because they might have, you know how it is when you finish school, you're like, I ain't doing any kind of homework. I don't want to do anything that resembles anything that looks like what I did at school. Completely understand. And then after time, as people get out there and work, they realize, okay, you know what, I want to enhance what it is that I do. So we do work on this. And so this is one category. And cues and signals, whether it happens in sign or English, I can predict when I see this word or I see that sign, it's cause and effect, right? So if is a good example in ASL, I can assume there's going to be some sort of result that's coming. I can predict that, and then my English will reflect what it should sound like in a cause and effect. If I can predict that it's coming based on the cue sign that I saw, then my tone will match it, right? It will follow the cadence of a cause and effect. Compare and contrast, there are words, right, that are used to signal a comparison's coming. you can read the slide. I guess I don't need to go into it that much, but I ask when people are doing this discourse analysis to follow these categories that I've identified. This people's tendency to throw everything into the cues and signals, and I will explain some of the other categories and how I try to differentiate that. So to me, these are very explicit words used by the speaker or the signer that let me know it's a description or an illustration is coming, right? So for example, all right, now I know something's coming up, an illustration. Teacher's going to or share a story. This one time, oh, story's coming. Problem solution, right, is another category. So first thing that we're going to talk about, so when I hear that, I know a list is coming. So even though they haven't said 2, 3, 4, 5, or next or then, I can guess with some certainty that there are going to be some things that are going to be covered today. And then transitions is another thing. Now, transitions can be explicit, and a lot of transitions can be implicit. So I would put my explicit, what's actually said, what's actually signed, into this cue signal category, right? Moving on is an example of, all right, that's a clear transition. But there are times in English where it's a change in tone of voice, or it is, or in sign, it might just be hands dropped or a head nod, right? There may not be a very explicit sign, but there's something I can pick up on that lets me know a transition's happening, and then we identify that in a different category. All right, so we watched that TED Talk, and I use this as an example to help walk and guide people through this analysis. This is only my experience, and as I have said before, there's so much to learn about English and American Sign Language. I find it very humbling, to be honest, and it's for me the tool that helped me, like I said, break free from the English form. But in order for us to be able to be effective, we have to understand English in more depth. Historically, training programs or four-year programs focus heavily. I don't want to make that assumption, but historically, some programs tend to focus on this, which is great, on the signing piece, and why some people look really, why are some interpreters look really effective? They've got good sign articulation, they're clear. But once you know what you're doing and you start to watch folks, you recognize that they're not really interpreting. And if deaf people could monitor what was happening in the source language and then compare it to what's happening in the target language, they may realize they're not getting everything that they're supposed to be getting. And I don't mean that as a criticism. It's actually, for me, was very eye-opening about what was missing from my work. So we're going to look at this discourse map. Give me a second here to open it up, because when I open it up online, it's very ugly. It just takes a second for it to show up here. I'll make it bigger. So this is the advantage of the webinar, is that I can share these documents with you and you can see it up close. Is that clear on the screen? Everybody can see this pretty well? I'm assuming yes. Keith, if you give me a head nod, I know that people can see it. All right, good. So the first step that we do is understanding the discourse type. And I don't want us to get too buried into it, but we have persuasive, narrative, procedural, conversational, what else was it? Argumentative, okay? Like those are the basics. If you've done public speaking in college, you might have experienced some trauma trying to provide a speech in one of those discourse types. But with that said, there are some things that you can expect within a discourse type. Now, we've talked about this piece being somewhat persuasive, because if you watch his presentation all the way through, he is really trying to encourage people to change the way that they are present in the moment, right? How they view their family, how they view their relationships. Don't wait till it's too late. Don't have a near-death experience to be able to glean the lessons that I'm sharing with you. Like, take advantage of the time now. So we could argue that there's some persuasive piece, and that also there's a lot of narrative. He's jumping back and forth between the persuasive and the narrative, because one, he's like, here are the things that I learned. Here's what I'm changing. Here's what I'm going to do. Here's what I think you should do. But he tells a story along the way as a way to, share with you what was going on in his mind, what was happening to him as the story was unfolding. So I asked students we have this grid of all the discourse types. What are some linguistic features that will present itself typically within that? As we get more advanced, we might start identifying it within the story even more. Like, when do we see the use of rhetorical questions? When do we see how do we see the ideas being set up? When do we see that these pauses happen intentionally, because I want you to listen to what it is that I'm telling you, so that I can persuade you to change your actions. Narrative has a lot of character interaction. It's done in past tense. So they're already knowing that there's a story here. He's jumping into, in the moment, and then he goes back in time talking about the experience. So I must mark that in my interpretation, right? I have to make it clear the distinction of when he's in that story and when he's giving advice. Okay? The next thing that I ask people to do is, we usually do this after a student has interpreted something. So a lot of what we do in the classroom, I will sign my lectures, and students will have to interpret it into English, or I will do a presentation in English and students have to sign it. Students are then expected to record their work in the classroom real time. They do get prepped, they do get to prepare most of the time. And what they'll do is they have to identify in a 15-minute lecture that they interpreted what were some of the trouble spots, right? So you don't have to transcribe the entire piece that you are working on, right? But identify those maybe 4 or 5 areas that you felt like, I don't know if I was clear on that part, so I want to go back and dive into that. So that's what I asked them to do. So you could do the entire piece, which I do for the first few minutes of this, but I want you to understand that for your own professional development, I strongly encourage you to start recording yourself in the classroom. Start recording yourself doing discussions or lectures. What is it that you're doing in real time? And then you go back, take that video and look at that video. Do it with a colleague, and maybe start doing some of this discourse analysis that I'm sharing with you to understand why you do what you do. And this also can affirm, I am actually doing a lot of this, which is a good thing. So it's not like, what am I doing wrong? It's not only intended for error analysis, it's also to instill in you confidence in the decisions that you're making and assessing whether you are being effective or not. So going back to the 3 things, you can pick a chunk as little or as big as you want. And so source language, this is what he said in English. And so I typed that up. And what I'm going to be doing this fall that I have not done before, but I know I'm going to do it this time, is I'm going to create another category. I have 2 screens, which is why I keep looking to my right, if you're wondering why does she keep looking over there. Is I am going to be asking the students to, underneath their source language, provide me their ASL gloss. What did you sign for that? What did you actually sign? Just type it up. And the ASL gloss, you do not need it to be like the official way of William Stokey's glossing system. That's not what I'm asking students to do. In general, use your capital letters to give me a sense of what you signed. all right? But we're not, quote unquote, analyzing what we saw them sign. We're going back to the English, but it's good for them to be able to compare. This is what I did. This is what they said. Now let me dig deeper into it. And we're definitely doing the post-game analysis, right? Where coulda, shoulda, would have, given the hindsight that I have now. So that's a step I'm going to add to this. Add your ASL gloss of what you actually did. And then I asked them to do some sort of visualization. With technology, it's very easy to go find something online, but this has to be when you hear him telling his story, you have to visualize yourself in the cabin, right? You have to visualize yourself being on a plane that's full of smoke. What would that look like to you, right? So you have to have some sort of mental picture for that. And if a student doesn't have that because they don't have the background, they don't have the experience, you go look it up, right? Because that might have been probably block number one. If you don't even know what it looks like, there's no way you can represent that visually. You can't represent that visually. So in the classroom, knowing that the teacher is going to be talking about, the digestive system, and that's an easy example, but how well do you know it? What do those organs look like? How does each of those body parts relate to one another? What are the mechanisms that drive the digestive system? So I need to have some sort of visual in my head so that I can then represent that off my hands when interpreting. So I ask people to put in pictures. Now you can draw them or you can cheat like I do because I like pictures. But it matches what my schema is my point. So then the next thing I ask students or interpreters to do is, okay, so don't look at the English. What is this? What's the point of this? What is it that, someone walked in and like, yeah, what's he talking about? That's the line, like that's the intent. So for me in this particular chunk, it's a little line, but he's asking you to imagine this really scary scene. He's setting up the story, right? Like you would never want to be in this situation. This is like your worst nightmare, right? And so moving on, so that's my understanding of this piece. Like, okay, now I know where he's going with this, right? Because he wants to bring people into this experience. He wants them to feel what he felt. They don't know that yet, but he wants them to feel what he felt when he was on the plane experiencing a near-death experience. All right, so then for a cue word, remember I showed you the slide, it is an actual word that helps me go, oh, he's about to go into something. So he says, imagine. It's not hard, that's pretty obvious, but imagine. So now, as Mary so beautifully signed, is I can now set the scene. I understand that he's going to do some description of this experience. Like I can start figuring that out. Let's see if it's, yeah, there we go. So the next category, this to me is the most important category, and it is often overlooked in what we do, and it is the how. So this is everything but the words or the signs themselves. It is how things are expressed or how they're said. And this is where I try to get students to pay a lot of attention to. So for example, in this piece, he, pauses a lot in his presentation. He's trying to let it sink in. I want you to think about that. I want you to feel that. So I think he's quite intentional in the way that he pauses. So he pauses after each description, right? So if I'm recognizing that that's what he should be, that he's doing that in the source language, my prosody, my pausing should also mirror that effectively, right? And are my pauses happening at the right time to get the most bang for my buck, to provide the impact that he's trying to achieve with his own audience? When he says the word clack, 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 and he says it just like that, really like startling, And his intention is to startle you, right? Because he's trying to get you into that moment of like, whoa, what is that? What was that sound? And then at the end, he's looking for affirmation and agreement when he states, it sounds scary. He also does this head nod kind of thing, like, sounds scary, right? And you in the audience would be like, yeah, that sounds scary. What do I do with that? I might explicitly say, right? Does that sound like an awful situation? Yeah. So taking that implicit piece of it sounds scary, do you feel the same, right? Would you be scared in that situation? Yes, you would, is what he's saying. So those are just some examples of that one little sentence of his how, what he does with it, what he does with his tone, what he does with his pausing. So then I move into, all right, so what's happening in English? What are some source language features of English that are salient, that I must do something with, or at least be aware of that he is doing, and then I have to make some decisions. How does that impact what I'm doing in the target language of American Sign Language? So in this piece, I'm naming the imagine, it's a hypothetical, right? I know it's a hypothetical. All right, so that's good. And there's a way that I can signal a hypothetical in American Sign Language. He's also using onomatopoeia with the sound of the clack, 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 right? Because that's the words reflect what it sounds like. Hope I'm saying that correctly. And then he is in present tense. Imagine a big explosion as you climb. I don't need to read that again. And then he uses the adjective scary, right? So that to me is, those are things I'm paying attention to. What you might pay attention to is different, and that's okay. I'm giving this as an example. So those are the things that I have identified in the source language of English that I have to prioritize and give some attention to. So now I'm thinking about, what ASL features do I have at my disposal? So it's a good idea to, I have this discourse guide. It's loosely put together that gives examples of keywords or signs. I have a sheet that has transitions on it. I then have some examples of non-utterances or non-verbal utterances. So I have more details. I will have Keith and Mary share that with you, but for the sake of time, I can't go into all that. But when we're working on this discourse analysis, I ask students to have these documents in front of them, because it may not rise immediately that they have access to, what are those features? I don't know what they are, but looking at handouts that names all the English features, and looking at the handout that names all the ASL features, having that in front of you as a visual as I'm looking through it helps me remember and go, oh, you know what? I think it's this. This might be what's happening. So with ASL as my target language, I start to think about how much I want to use depiction or role shifting. So I will think about how I'm going to be the passenger. I'm going to become him in the plane sitting. Another ASL feature that I could use is something called constructed dialogue, right? And so what is it that he is thinking about when he's flying in the plane? So he might, even though in his source language of English, he hasn't said, look at that, there's smoke. I might, in an ASL interpretation, become him sitting on the plane, getting ready, reading the book, looking at my tablet as I start to read, and then all of a sudden I can respond, I can role shift, like I hear something, what's that sound? Oh, and then I can, again, it's my thoughts, I didn't express it out loud in the plane, but I'm thinking to myself, that's not good. I see smoke in the plane. Okay, wait, what's going on? I can become that person, and I can show that what he was living through, sitting in that chair, seeing the smoke, right? Not knowing what's going on and hearing this very startling sound. I can use that ASL feature to get that across. I'm thinking, so I'm moving on here. It's still in the target language. I'm going to use eye gaze. I think about the elemental classifier for smoke, right? Because smoke, we got to show what that smoke looks like in the cabin. You know, was it like this? Was it like this? Was it, you know, how did it look? It doesn't matter how you choose to use the elemental classifier for smoke, but as long as I know that there's smoke in the cabin, you're good. And then here, it sounds scary. Okay, so I understand what I was doing with that. It could be a yes/no question, right? So I could set that up as a rhetorical, scary. Oh yeah, right? Or do I just leave it seems scary? Do I really want to ask my audience and see if they're going to ask? So a rhetorical can be a yes/no question as well. You can combine the two into one. That makes sense. Okay. And then I will try to use the conjunction happen, right? Because as he's flying, the big explosion, so I have to show what's happening before the explosion. There's nothing has happened, and then bam, happened. I hear this sound, right? So I got to be explicit that something changed, right? All right. And then making sure that my non-manuals convey fear. So you could use also another ASL feature of like faceting, right? Where scary, like, ooh, like could be. And I don't know if I would do it for this particular presenter. I don't think he was like, ah, but that's where my brain goes. If that's an adjective that he is expressing, ASL sometimes will facet an adjective and use 2 or 3 signs to convey the idea of like just how scary it really was. So that is some examples, one example of how I work through one itty bitty chunk here. So I'm going to move to another one, which I think is important. So if you notice here, he says, imagine a big explosion as you climb through 3,000 feet. Imagine a plane full of smoke. Imagine an engine going clack, 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 clack. It sounds scary. His next words are, well, I had a unique seat that day. That's his transition. And so there's a lot in that transition that you have to think about, where if I sign that literally, that would not make sense. Okay. So let me just read this part to you. Well, I had a unique seat that day. I was sitting in 1D. I was the only one who could talk to the flight attendants. So I looked at them right away and they said, no problem. We probably hit some birds. The pilot had already turned the plane around and we weren't that far. You could see Manhattan. 2 minutes later, 3 things happened at the same time. So this is a little bit longer of a chunk. Again, there's no right or wrong in how you choose to break things up. It's completely up to you. But here is my lovely picture of the flight attendant. There you go, whatever. But they're sitting, they're by the phone. Okay, that's me looking at them. So what I understand as the intent is that he's going to transition to his own personal experience on a plane. He talks about how he's seated directly from the flight attendant. And because it was takeoff, they were seated as well, right? That doesn't get explicitly stated in the source language, okay? They're all seated. So some cue words. Well is a transition. Now I know that he's moving into something. I can predict. And then he says 3 things happen, right? That's that sequence cue, right? So as he's moving through what 3 things he learns, and he is explicit in it, luckily, but sometimes they'll say the next thing, another thing, and even though initially he identified 3 things, you should be remembering that he said, I'm going to do 3 things, even though he may not say the second thing I learned and then the third thing I learned. That it does happen, but sometimes it doesn't. So being aware of that and how you move through in your interpretation is really important. Okay. I am now moving into the how. So I noticed a rising intonation on well, and then he emphasizes on only, okay, he was the only one that could talk to the flight attendants. He was in a unique position that day. And he uses a hand gesture to show his proximity to the flight attendant, right? So you get the sense from his hand gesture. Now that's a nonverbal thing that he's doing, but there's information in there about proximity. And that his emphasis on the only one, like he had insider knowledge as to what was going to be happening with this plane. So then when the flight attendant says no problem, I identify it was done in a reassuring tone. That's important for me to identify because it's going to affect my non-manuals. So in this how column, when we're listening to tone, I ask people to put an adjective to it. Like if you had to describe that tone, did they sound affirming? Did they sound unsure? Did it sound critical? Did they sound doubtful, right? Because the words themselves may not reflect that, but the how does. I need you to start naming that, because that's why when people try to move to the target language of ASL, and you'll see that they don't have a lot of non-manuals, because they're not thinking very deliberately about the how and what does that how mean. So even in that, like she said in a reassuring tone, so he was like, oh, okay, I mean, if she's not scared, then I'm not going to be scared because she knows more than I do what's happening on this flight.
Pam, I do just want to let you know that we are at 10:30, so I just wanted to let you know where you're at with time.
Yep, thank you very much. And so we weren't that far. Again, how he says things give you an idea as a listener, like, we're okay, like nothing, we don't need to worry. And then there was a long pause after 3 things happened. That pause lets you know, in my assessment, something's about to go wrong, right? And that pause has a lot of information, so I need to think about that. And actually, I should probably add that, like, uh-oh, what's coming? Another example of source language features. So I wrote here, the transition, even though he uses the word well, what is meant by that transition is that what you just imagined, what I asked you to imagine, actually happened to me. So I think as an interpreter, I have to make that explicit. Whoa, where did my screen go? There it is. So I need to make that explicit in the target language of ASL, right? If I don't make that explicit, like, so I just asked you to imagine that awful experience, it happened to me, right? And so then you move into the story. But if I was to not transition that clearly, that would be very hard to follow, right? But as listeners of the English language and how stories are told and how people move back and forth, we've developed the ear for that. We've become accustomed. ASL does it very differently, right? So that kind of stuff is the stuff that you have to be paying attention to. In English, there is character interaction happening in the source language, right? So he and the flight attendants are having this conversation. There is some direct speech that is present in the source language. I identify that. And then the identification that this was in past tense, so it went from the hypothetical to this happened to me, right? So we're switching the tense. And then now that I've identified these salient features in English, what could I do with that in ASL? What are my options? So as I explained before, I would make that scene or that transition explicit. I'm always going to use role shifting and constructed dialogue and constructed action. Those are, I would actually say discourse maps probably instilled in me the most confidence to be able to do role shifting well and to be able to use constructed dialogue well. Because now that I understood these things and I had the visual, I had the schema, I understood the adjectives, I understood the how, then being able to move that into what would it look like to be in that moment. That has freed up my interpretations tremendously. And for some of you, maybe that's been really easy for you, but for me, that was not. I need things really explicit and explained to me. So this understanding how to move from English, understanding all those component parts, and then figuring out what features are doable or applicable in ASL, and then I might play around with some ideas, like I will write my ASL gloss here. It's not set in stone. I don't have to follow it that way, but I can type it up and try it out and see how it feels, right? And then I can compare my new possible translation to, remember when I told you I'm going to have the students give me their ASL gloss. Now we can start to compare, like, oh yeah, there were no transitions in that initial one. I was very linear. I followed the source language too closely. That part that was implicit, I did not make that explicit. But you know what? In my new possible translation, it is far easier to follow, right? So how you set up your discourse map is completely up to you. But for me, it's all this, as I'm looking at it, shows me all the different things that your brain is trying to process, which is why this work is so hard, is that we have to teach ourselves how to pick up these parts so that we can simultaneously manage all that cognitively to be able to do something effective in ASL. So I want to affirm you, I get it. It's hard, it's what we're doing. So I've given you 2 examples of how I might work through this. There are a couple more examples on this discourse map that you will have access to and that you can look at, and we can, if you've got feedback for me or suggestions or ideas, please share. I'm way open to that. This is something that I have struggled with and worked with, and I keep improving upon, and I will continue to work on it. So there's more here, but I want to go on in the rest of my presentation because I want to emphasize the how and how important the how is. Let me get out of this. So I believe Keith and Mary will be sending you this PowerPoint, and you should be able to access the links. If you're having any difficulties, let me know. We'll follow up in an email and get you what you need. So when I was talking about the how, I'm talking about the nonverbals or anything but the signs. And here's, okay. So it can be how long a word is held. We talked about the pauses. In ASL, it's the blinks. It's the dropping of the hands. It can be a brow change. What are they doing with their hand position? Torso. So this list is both for what can happen in spoken language and what can happen in sign language, right? It's not one or the other. Both of these things could happen, but certainly blinks have a lot more meaning in ASL than it does, say, in English, unless I was, winking to my audience about something, but that would be information in the how, right? So if a presenter said something and they were trying to be sarcastic and they did this little wink, wink, right? I would, in my discourse analysis, identify that as information because, me signing wink, wink to a deaf person might work, but I might do something like, what a joke, or like, ha ha ha, or like, something to convey that I'm being very sarcastic, right? Or I'm being ironic, or I'm saying the opposite of what I actually mean. So this is the how. So, and if this commercial is my favorite. It highlights the importance of the work of how things are said, context, setting, who are the participants. Unfortunately, this is also a video link that I think Keith and Mary have to share with you. I'm going to play it, but all you need to know is that the word dude. It's a Bud Light commercial. It's the word dude said over and over and over again. And okay. So just for the sake of time, Grace, who was a wonderful student and now is working as an interpreter, she kindly offered to volunteer for this workshop when I did it for Region 3. And I will tell you, she got to do this a couple times. The first time she did it, like I would, if I was to play this video, a lot of people would gravitate to fingerspelling dude. And they might have the right facial expression, like, dude, dude, dude. But they tend to get really stuck on the word dude, and they feel compelled to have to fingerspell the word dude every single time. So I'll play this video in class, students will partner up, and I will ask them to think about every time he says dude, what is meant by dude? And they get stuck, right? It's happened several times. So what I have in this video is she's getting some good ideas, but doesn't have the confidence to move ahead and actually tell me what dude means each time. So I'm going to skip ahead. So after watching that, I can tell you the video is, somewhat literal. I challenge you as interpreters to understand the cultural framework. Like, if I fingerspell dude 10 times, the way that a hearing person receives that information versus, say, a deaf person, is that equivalent? It's not. And so sometimes having to do a little explanation, right? That here's the word dude, because I know in my circles, I don't think my dad uses the sign for fingerspells. I don't know if there is a sign for the word dude in ASL. I haven't really seen it. And so already it's not funny to them. So if any of you know a sign for dude other than fingerspelling, do share with me, because I haven't seen it. But I'm also old and outdated, so whatever. But the point being, the idea of dude, I can do a little cultural mediation, like just let you know the word dude is coming up every single time. But I feel then compelled to, like, what's his point? Where is he going with this? Like, what does dude mean each time? And so as long as I can give that schema, I do that couching, like get the schema of the deaf person to understand that dude is a word that's used in hearing culture, and the way that it's said can carry very different meanings given the context, right? So we have to then, there's what the sender intends, right? And the sender wants the recipient to be able to decode what that is, right? And so our job as the interpreter then is to decode that on behalf. We have to culturally mediate that, and then we have to do the appropriate adjustments to at least to try to make that equivalent. So in that video, we have several mini scenes. We have what we call the couch scene. You can read this. The desk tapper. The woman walks by. Right, so part of discourse analysis is looking at the setting where they're moving furniture. You can read this all. I identified the weightlifting, the underwear. Then we have the bees. Then he takes out the little heart thing that he's got in the closet. He's like, dude. Right. There's the milk, workload, he's playing football. He's with his girlfriend on the couch. There's that one. Kitchen, he's alone. There's the line jumper, and then there's a scene with the wine versus the beer. Right. So I have on this PowerPoint slide all the different scenes that take place in this Bud Light commercial with only the word dude in it. What's the intent? What's implicit? And what must I make explicit? That is your job. okay? And I'm able to pick those clues up from how he says things and by looking at the setting. So I had Joel Mankowski do this with me, and he's hilarious on how he did it. So it might play. So let me just play. Let's see what happens. Let's see if it works. It's the Bud Light commercial, and I know you're not going to be able to sync it up because you can't hear it, but I just want you to see what he does. Okay. Sorry for that last sign. But so Joel does a great job of, he just watches what's unfolding. So I did give him the preface of the guy saying dude every time, but he just watched it his first time watching it, looking at how people were interacting. And then if you could see, he had a different way of signing it each time, right? I wonder as interpreters, would we have the confidence to go, what does it mean each time? I'm encouraging you, I'm giving you the permission to do that because that's what we should be doing. So if I was to do this explicitly, if I was really putting on my think like an interpreter, be an interpreter, or be native-like, when you'll see here on the slide, I have all the different scenes. And if I was to choosing to be explicit, here's what I think I would try to sign, right? And making sure that I have the proper non-manuals, but you're sitting too close to me. Get away from me. That's the first dude, right? The guy that's tapping his pen on the desk, I would be signing like, stop, finish, okay? When the woman walks by, the two guys are in the office, and he's like, dude, what he's saying is check her out, is what he means, right? Me signing dude would not equate at all to that, right? How would they be able to pick that up? Moving the furniture. It's like, dude, he's yelling. He's saying, I'm going to drop it. Like, help me, is what he's yelling. That's being explicit, right? The weightlifting. I don't know if that shows it. There's a couple of different variations of this video. Underwear. The guy his buddy walks by in his underwear, and he says, dude, what he's saying, like, really, I don't want to see that, right? The bees. I don't know how you sign holy crap, but that's this is what it means, like, holy hell, get away. The idea of when he goes in his buddy's closet and he sees this little keepsake of like this heart thing that probably belonged to his girlfriend, or maybe it's his, who knows? He's like, why do you have this? What's this all about? Right? And then the milk, right? Tastes or smells nasty. I'm not drinking it. So I have other examples here too, but you get it, right? So that one word dude can be interpreted so many different ways, right? So what are you doing in the classroom when you hear things from students, from peers, from teachers, right? If you are being so literal, but we're not giving our kids what they mean, what they're talking about, just so you know, I absolutely believe that we have to do that. I still have to do that for my stepdaughter. I still have to do that for my dad. I live it. I see it. And once I do that, because I understand in terms of that incidental learning, that language deprivation, that the minimal access is, I need to give that to them so then they can understand, and then I can move ahead through the interpretation. This is another fun activity that I ask people to get through, and I'm sorry for those of you that like cats. I do like cats. I don't have any issues, but it does say every time you ask a stupid question, God kills a kitten. So there's no such thing as a stupid question. But this one is, again, when I talk to you about the how, it's the same sentence, but what word you emphasize completely changes the meaning. So I didn't tell her you were stupid. I didn't tell her you were stupid. I didn't tell her you were stupid. You get it. It changes the meaning. So you can read that, and I want you to think about, oh my goodness, if I was in a class and I had to interpret this particular slide, how do I show that and show some equivalent? Am I paying attention? Or do I just sign it the same way every time? I'll jump to the next slide here. So some of the things, part of the handout that I have for you goes into some of these ASL features. I'm trying to move through my piece right here. Through ASL features, there's more information on some of the commonly used things: depiction, uses constructed dialogue and action. I'm not going to name them here, but these are some of the basic features that can help generate some ideas for you on what to do in the target language of ASL. And then on this next slide are some grammar source language features of English. Again, this is not an all-inclusive list, but it's nice to have it, to look at it and go, all right, were they using a rhetorical? Were they using a command? Was it a yes? I can just read through it, look at what chunk I've identified, look at this handout and say, okay, maybe they were using some passive voice. Now, passive voice gets used a lot in English. In ASL really doesn't use passive voice in the same way that English does. So what I have to do with it is, the president was shot. That's a very common example of passive voice. Well, it doesn't explicitly say somebody shot the president. And I must then put in an ASL, I got to make it active voice. I have to put a subject there. So somebody, I don't know who it was, but we can assume, listening to that in English, because it was passive voice, I must change it into active voice and put someone in there. I'm not naming it, I'm not identifying who it is, but that's another example of what's salient in English, then what must I do with it in ASL for it to be equivalent and understood by my deaf students. Okay? So those are some examples there. I like my little grammar support group slide. But for the sake of time, I'm not going to go into it, but these are some other really good things to know. Powerless speech, right? Hedges, hesitations, polite forms. And if these are things that are not familiar to you, that's okay. Go back, review, look it up. That's what I have to do. And every day I'm trying to expand my repertoire of what I understand in the source language of English. Degrees of directness. So here's another way that you could use a discourse map. Lots of people like to do it this way. I have not mastered how to do it. It's hard to fit everything in it this way as opposed to the grid that I showed you, but it's another visual for you on how to do a concept map. And you can see that I've taken all the elements that I showed you in that TED Talk that I've put it in here. So here I analyze the source language again. The first one was, I didn't tell her you were stupid. The intent of that, someone else told her you were stupid. That's what that means, right? So if I understand that that's the intent, how do I develop then the confidence to go, can I actually go there with that in ASL, right? If I hear that in English, do I understand? Oh, someone else told her that you were stupid. Probably. I would argue yes. So you can see here on this map, I talk about the how, the emphasis on the word, well, I didn't tell her. Right? Source language features, something's implicit. I'm not going to read it to you in great detail. You can see it here, you have access, but then you see here a possible translation. You stupid? I'm going to read ASL gloss to you. You stupid? Me tell that woman? And I can roll shift and become her. You stupid? No, another person responsible, not me, innocent me. I never said that, right? So you could do it. That's one way to do it. So I leave you with this last example to think about. And it's really, again, a very, very good example of how important the how is, and understanding context and understanding the setting and who the participants in. They say exactly the same thing. You've seen the State Farm commercial, right? And again, you have this link to go and watch it. but it compares a teenager and a businessman. So the teenager is being gifted a car, and the businessman who's walking, I'm assuming he's a businessman, it's just the way I decided to label him, his car has been broken into, right? And so they go back and forth between each character saying exactly the same thing. And how I would encourage you to think about, oh boy, how would I make the distinction between each person, even though they're saying the exact same thing? So this is more of this is taking it up a notch of understanding the how and the context and the setting and the participants. So I'm sure if you watch TV, it's funny because I've seen this on TV, and then when I talk to 20-year-olds, they're like, yeah, you know that we don't watch TV. We, just everything's Hulu or stream. We're not watching commercials. I go, okay, well, if you haven't seen this commercial, go watch it, because it's a really good example of how we must do some serious discourse analysis with this piece and get across what is being meant. A lot of people will argue, well, you're not giving them equal access. It's not equal access if I leave it literally, right? That's not interpreting. That's not what we do. I can give them the cultural mediation and explain, okay, I want you to understand, they're both saying the same thing, but they really mean something different. So I just want you to know that's what they're doing, but I want you to see how things change depending on which character we're talking about. That's the best I can do. I don't know how else to do it. So if you have a better way of doing it, but again, I'm affirmed over and over in my job and in my interactions with deaf people. When I told you how I watch how deaf people interact, this is what they do. When they watch an interpreter who tends to present something a little bit more literal, even though they use beautiful face, even though they have beautiful facial expression, what they're missing is intent. And what I see deaf people do, what she means is, and you're like, that's what they do. Okay, so then why am I not doing it? I need to do that. And I do it. And people are like, oh, that might be too much information. Like, I think it's crossing the line, Pam. I have never had a deaf person go to me, whoa, you're way too clear. You're way too explicit for me. I cannot handle that. We actually err on the side of not enough. There's lots of gaps in our communication. So I would challenge you to move this way. And if it's something that's understood by the deaf person, they're like, yeah, I got it, cool. Then I just gravitate back. You know what I mean? I accommodate accordingly. But I encourage you to try to go to this end of the continuum. And I bet our kids in the classroom will have, I think we'll be able to be probably a bit more successful if we allow ourselves as interpreters to do some of these things. So I am now at the last minute. And if this is something that interests you and you are serious about achieving dynamic equivalence in your interpreting work, please reach out to me, follow up with me. I'd be happy to take this to the next level and we can start working with some K-12 content. And I can walk you through some video analysis, and we can fishbowl, how do I listen to something? How do I analyze it? How do we do this, right? So you can share that feedback with me. You can share that feedback with Keith and Mary. I hope you have found this helpful. And please email me with questions, anything you'd like me to clarify. If there are handouts you'd like me to pass along, I'd be more than happy to do that for you. And with that, I'll give it back to Keith and Mary.
Awesome. Thank you, Pam. Again, thank you for your time and your willingness to share with us and be a part of our first Interpreter Refresher series. Again, in the chat, we've noticed there was may have been some audio issues. Again, we apologize